Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that while Washington obsesses over tariffs and trade wars, the real battle for global supremacy has already been decided? And what if the outcome is not what any American politician wants to admit? The uncomfortable truth is this: America is not winning the competition with China. In fact, the United States is losing ground so rapidly that the current trajectory points toward an economic reckoning that will fundamentally reshape the global order within the next decade. Yet the Trump administration, along with much of the American political establishment, continues to operate under a dangerous delusion that aggressive tariffs, tough rhetoric, and nationalist posturing can somehow reverse decades of strategic miscalculation. They cannot. The reality is far more sobering, far more complex, and far more urgent than the simplified narratives presented to the American public. You are about to discover why China's rise is not just inevitable, but why America's attempts to contain it are accelerating its own decline. And more critically, you will understand why the policies currently championed as solutions are actually hastening the very collapse they claim to prevent. This is not about politics. This is about mathematics, economics, and the irreversible momentum of historical forces that no amount of political theater can alter. For decades, American politicians have sold the public a comforting fiction that China's economic growth was built on stolen technology, currency manipulation, and unfair trade practices, and that once America got tough, once we imposed the right penalties and restrictions, China would crumble and American manufacturing would roar back to life. This narrative is not just simplistic, it is dangerously wrong. The foundation of China's rise is far more substantial than any political talking point acknowledges. Let me give you a number that should shatter any remaining illusions. In 2000, China's economy was roughly 1/8 the size of America's. Today, depending on how you measure it, China's economy is either approaching parity with the United States or has already surpassed it. When adjusted for purchasing power parity, the metric economists consider most relevant for comparing actual economic output, China has been the world's largest economy since 2016. Let that sink in for a moment. For nearly a decade, China has produced more goods and services than the United States. Yet American politicians continue to speak as if the United States holds all the leverage in this relationship. But here is the critical point. The gap is not narrowing slowly, it is widening at an accelerating pace. The International Monetary Fund projects that by 2030, China's economy will be approximately 30% larger than America's when measured by purchasing power parity. By 2040, China could be nearly twice the size of the U.S. economy. These are not wild predictions from anti-American critics. These are sober assessments from mainstream international financial institutions based on current growth trajectories. Consider what this means in practical terms. Economic size translates directly into geopolitical influence, military capability, technological advancement, and the ability to set global standards. The nation with the largest economy determines which currencies are used for international trade, which technology platforms dominate global markets, which countries receive investment and development assistance, and ultimately, which values and systems of governance gain ascendancy worldwide. For 75 years, that nation has been the United States. That era is ending, and no amount of tariffs can stop it. The Trump administration's primary weapon in this competition has been tariffs, massive taxes on Chinese imports designed to penalize Beijing, protect American workers, and force manufacturing back to the United States. The problem is that tariffs are not working. In fact, they are backfiring spectacularly, and the damage is being absorbed almost entirely by American consumers and businesses. When President Trump imposed his first round of tariffs on Chinese goods in 2018, the promise was straightforward. China would pay the price, American companies would return home, and the trade deficit would shrink. None of these things happened. Instead, American importers paid the tariffs, then passed those costs directly to consumers through higher prices. Study after study from organizations ranging from the Federal Reserve to independent economic research firms confirmed the same finding. Tariffs function as a tax on Americans, not on China. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York estimated that Trump's tariffs cost the average American household approximately $831 per year in higher prices. Multiply that across every household in America, and you are looking at tens of billions of dollars extracted from American wallets annually. But the situation deteriorates further. American manufacturers that depend on Chinese components, everything from electronics to industrial machinery to medical devices, suddenly faced dramatically higher input costs. These businesses could not simply relocate their supply chains overnight. Building new factories, establishing new supplier relationships, and reorganizing complex global production networks takes years and requires enormous capital investment. So instead, they absorbed higher costs, reduced their workforce, or in many cases, simply went out of business. Meanwhile, the trade deficit with China, the very metric Trump claimed would improve, barely budged. In 2018, before the major tariffs, the U.S. goods trade deficit with China was approximately $419 billion. After years of tariffs and trade war escalation, what was the deficit in 2024? Approximately $279 billion. Yes, it declined, but not because American manufacturing surged. It declined because American consumers purchased fewer goods overall due to higher prices, and because some imports shifted from China to other countries like Vietnam, Mexico, and Bangladesh. The production did not return to America. It simply moved to other foreign locations. The jobs did not come back. They went elsewhere. Here is where the situation becomes intensely personal for millions of Americans. John Anderson, a small business owner in Ohio who manufactures automotive parts, told reporters that the tariffs on Chinese steel and aluminum increased his material costs by 43%. He could not pass all of those costs to his customers without losing business to foreign competitors who were not subject to the same constraints. So he cut his workforce from 23 employees to 14. 9 American families lost their livelihoods not because of Chinese competition, but because of American policy. His story is not unique. It is being replicated across thousands of small and medium-sized businesses throughout the country. The Manufacturing Association estimated that Trump's tariffs cost the American manufacturing sector approximately 75,000 jobs. These are not jobs lost to China. These are jobs eliminated by the very policies designed to protect them. The irony is absolutely crushing. But there is more, because the economic consequences extend far beyond immediate price increases and job losses. Tariffs have triggered massive retaliation from China, targeting American exports with surgical precision. Beijing imposed countermeasures on American agricultural products, particularly soybeans, pork, and dairy, industries concentrated in states that voted heavily for Trump. American farmers, who once enjoyed access to the world's largest consumer market, suddenly found themselves shut out. Chinese buyers, who had purchased billions of dollars of American agricultural products annually, turned to suppliers in Brazil, Argentina, and Australia instead. And here is the truly frightening part. Those relationships, once severed, do not simply resume when tariffs are lifted. Brazilian soybean farmers expanded their operations, invested in infrastructure, and built long-term partnerships with Chinese importers. Even if tariffs disappeared tomorrow, American farmers would struggle to regain market share they held for decades. The damage is not temporary, it is structural and potentially permanent. The American government attempted to compensate farmers for their losses through direct subsidies, essentially welfare payments funded by taxpayer dollars. Between 2018 and 2020, the federal government distributed approximately $28 billion in emergency aid to farmers affected by trade war retaliation. Let me put that figure into perspective. The government imposed tariffs that cost Americans tens of billions in higher prices, destroyed export markets for American farmers, then borrowed additional tens of billions to compensate those farmers for losses caused by government policy. This is not economic strategy. This is economic self-destruction financed by future generations. And still, American politicians claim the tariffs are working. Meanwhile, and this is the detail that should genuinely concern every American regardless of political affiliation, China is not standing still. While Washington engages in economic self-harm disguised as toughness, Beijing is executing a comprehensive, multi-decade strategy to dominate the industries and technologies that will define the 21st century. This is where the real competition is taking place, and America is losing badly. China has identified specific sectors as strategic priorities: artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotechnology, renewable energy, advanced manufacturing, and space exploration. The Chinese government is pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into research, development, and deployment of these technologies. This is not sporadic investment or market-driven allocation. This is centralized, coordinated, long-term industrial policy executed with ruthless efficiency. Consider artificial intelligence, perhaps the most transformative technology of our era. China is rapidly becoming the global leader in AI development and deployment. The country produces more AI research papers than the United States. Chinese companies like Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent are developing AI systems that rival or exceed anything produced by American firms. More critically, China is implementing AI across its economy at a scale that America cannot match. Facial recognition systems monitor cities. AI algorithms optimize manufacturing production. Machine learning enhances logistics and supply chain management. The Chinese government has declared AI a national priority and committed to becoming the world leader by 2030. They are on track to achieve that goal. But here is what American politicians refuse to acknowledge. China's AI advantage is not built on stolen American technology, though technology transfer certainly played a role in earlier stages. It is built on massive datasets. China has over 1 billion internet users, generating data constantly, substantial government investment, top-tier scientific talent, much of it educated at Chinese universities, and most importantly, the absence of regulatory barriers that slow deployment in Western democracies. While America debates the ethics of facial recognition, China deploys it nationwide. While American companies navigate complex privacy regulations, Chinese firms integrate AI into every sector of the economy without restriction. The result is that China is not just catching up in AI. In many applications, they have already pulled ahead. The same pattern repeats across multiple technology sectors. In renewable energy, China dominates global production of solar panels, controlling approximately 80% of the world's manufacturing capacity. Chinese companies produce the majority of the world's wind turbines. China has become the undisputed leader in electric vehicle production and battery technology. BYD, a Chinese company, now sells more electric vehicles globally than Tesla. The batteries that power electric cars worldwide are predominantly manufactured in China. When Europe and America transition to renewable energy and electric transportation, they will be dependent on Chinese technology and Chinese supply chains. This is not a vulnerability that tariffs can address. This is structural dominance built over decades of strategic investment. In advanced manufacturing, China has implemented Made in China 2025, an industrial policy designed to achieve self-sufficiency in 10 high-tech sectors, including semiconductors, robotics, aerospace, and new materials. American politicians derided this plan, claiming it was evidence of Chinese economic aggression. But derision is not a strategy. While America mocks China's ambitions, China executes them. The country is rapidly reducing its dependence on foreign technology while simultaneously increasing the world's dependence on Chinese production. American companies that once viewed China merely as a low-cost manufacturing base now face Chinese competitors that are technologically sophisticated, heavily capitalized, and supported by comprehensive government policies. Let me share an anecdote that perfectly illustrates this transformation. Michael Chen, an American entrepreneur who has been manufacturing consumer electronics in China for 15 years, recently told me that the relationship has fundamentally changed. 10 years ago, he explained, Chinese factories would manufacture products based on designs we provided. Today, those same factories are designing their own products, filing their own patents, and selling directly to global markets under their own brands. They don't need American companies anymore. We need them. This shift, replicated across thousands of businesses and industries, represents a tectonic change in global economic power. China is no longer the world's factory producing goods designed elsewhere. China is becoming the world's innovation center, designing, manufacturing, and distributing products under its own terms. The semiconductor industry provides perhaps the most critical example of America's strategic failure. Semiconductors, the tiny chips that power everything from smartphones to weapon systems, represent the foundation of modern technological civilization. For decades, America maintained leadership in chip design through companies like Intel, Qualcomm, and NVIDIA. However, the manufacturing of those chips increasingly migrated to East Asia, particularly Taiwan and South Korea. This created a dangerous vulnerability. America designs chips but cannot produce them at scale. China, recognizing this weakness, has invested over $150 billion in developing its domestic semiconductor industry. The goal is complete self-sufficiency, the ability to design and manufacture advanced chips without any foreign dependence. The Trump administration responded by restricting exports of semiconductor manufacturing equipment and chip designs to China, hoping to strangle China's chip industry before it matured. This strategy has backfired disastrously. Rather than crippling China's semiconductor ambitions, the restrictions have accelerated them. Chinese companies and the government recognize that dependence on American technology represents an unacceptable vulnerability, so they have doubled down on domestic development, accepting that progress might be slower initially but will ultimately result in complete independence from American suppliers. Meanwhile, American semiconductor companies have lost their largest customer. China represents approximately one-third of the global semiconductor market. Cutting off that market has cost American firms billions in revenue, reduced their research budgets, and weakened their competitive position globally. Dutch and Japanese companies, not subject to American restrictions, have eagerly filled the gap, selling equipment and technology to Chinese manufacturers. Here is the fundamental miscalculation. American policymakers assumed that denying China access to advanced technology would preserve American dominance. Instead, it has motivated China to develop domestic alternatives while simultaneously damaging American companies. In 5 years, China may possess fully indigenous semiconductor production capabilities. When that happens, American firms will have permanently lost not just a market, but leverage over a strategic sector. The window for using technology as a bargaining chip is rapidly closing, and the policy designed to keep that window open is actually slamming it shut. Now here's the issue that truly keeps strategic analysts awake at night, though you would never know it from listening to American political discourse. China's economic rise is fundamentally altering global financial architecture, and the United States is largely powerless to stop it. For 75 years, American economic dominance rested on a single foundation, the U.S. dollar's role as the world's reserve currency. This arrangement, established after World War II, meant that international trade was conducted primarily in dollars, central banks held dollar reserves, and commodities like oil were priced in dollars. This system granted America an extraordinary privilege. The U.S. could print dollars to pay for imports, run persistent trade deficits, and finance government spending at artificially low interest rates because the entire world needed dollars for trade and savings. But China is systematically dismantling this arrangement, and the process is accelerating. Beijing has been working for over a decade to internationalize the yuan, China's currency, and reduce global dependence on the dollar. This effort, once dismissed as futile by Western economists, is succeeding far beyond what anyone anticipated. China has established yuan clearing centers in dozens of countries. It has signed currency swap agreements with over 40 central banks, allowing those countries to trade directly in yuan without converting to dollars. It has created the cross-border interbank payment system, a Chinese alternative to SWIFT, the dollar-denominated global payment network that America uses as a financial weapon through sanctions. Most significantly, China is increasingly conducting trade in yuan rather than dollars. When China imports oil from Saudi Arabia or Russia, those transactions increasingly occur in yuan. When China invests in infrastructure projects across Africa, Asia, and Latin America through the Belt and Road Initiative, Those deals are financed in yuan. When countries seek alternatives to dollar-dominated financial systems, China offers a viable alternative. This shift is gradual but inexorable. Each transaction conducted in yuan rather than dollars represents a tiny erosion of American financial hegemony. Multiplied across trillions of dollars in annual trade, the cumulative effect is staggering. The implications of this transformation cannot be overstated. If the dollar loses its status as the world's primary reserve currency, America loses the ability to finance its lifestyle through debt. The U.S. government currently owes over $36 trillion, a figure that is sustainable only because global demand for dollar-denominated assets keeps interest rates artificially low. If that demand evaporates, interest rates will rise, debt service costs will explode, and the U.S. government will face impossible choices between funding social programs, maintaining military capabilities, and avoiding default. The American standard of living, built on decades of borrowing against future prosperity, will collapse. This is not hyperbole. This is mathematics. China understands this dynamic perfectly. Beijing does not need to defeat America militarily. It does not need to out-innovate America in every sector. It simply needs to provide the world with an alternative to the dollar-dominated system, then wait for the accumulated weight of American debt and deficits to trigger a crisis. The Trump administration's policies, particularly aggressive use of sanctions and financial warfare, are accelerating this process. Each time America weaponizes the dollar to punish adversaries, it motivates more countries to seek alternatives. Russia, after being cut off from SWIFT following its invasion of Ukraine, dramatically increased use of yuan and other currencies for trade. Iran, Venezuela, and North Korea, all targeted by American sanctions, have developed workarounds that bypass the dollar entirely. Even traditional American allies like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are exploring non-dollar trade arrangements, not because they oppose America, but because they recognize that dependence on any single currency represents a vulnerability. The Belt and Road Initiative, China's trillion-dollar infrastructure development program spanning over 140 countries, is fundamentally a strategy to create yuan-denominated economic integration across Eurasia, Africa, and beyond. China finances ports, railways, highways, power plants, and telecommunications networks. The countries receiving this investment become economically tied to China and increasingly conduct their trade in yuan. This is not charity. This is strategic investment designed to reshape global commerce around Chinese interests, and it is working. Countries from Pakistan to Kenya to Serbia are now more economically integrated with China than with the United States. When those nations need to choose sides in geopolitical disputes, their economic interests increasingly align with Beijing, not Washington. American politicians either do not understand this transformation or refuse to acknowledge it publicly. The Trump administration's approach to China focuses almost entirely on goods trade deficits and manufacturing jobs, 19th-century concerns in a 21st-century competition. Meanwhile, China is building the financial and physical infrastructure that will define global commerce for the next century. It is as if America is fighting over the scraps of the old order while China constructs an entirely new system. When historians look back on this era, they will identify America's failure to recognize and respond to China's financial and infrastructural strategy as the decisive strategic blunder that ended American primacy. But the consequences of America's impending collapse extend far beyond economics. What we are witnessing is a fundamental erosion of American global leadership across every dimension: diplomatic, cultural, ideological, and military. For decades, American power rested not just on economic strength, but on the perception that the American model, democratic governance, market economics, individual rights, offered the best path to prosperity and human flourishing. That perception is dying, and Trump's policies are hastening its demise. Consider the diplomatic dimension first. The Trump administration pursued an America-first foreign policy characterized by withdrawal from international agreements, hostility toward traditional allies, and transactional relationships based solely on narrow self-interest. The U.S. withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a trade agreement specifically designed to counter Chinese influence in Asia. This created a vacuum that China eagerly filled by negotiating the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, now the world's largest trade bloc, encompassing 15 countries and nearly a third of global GDP, with China at its center. The Trump administration withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement, ceding global leadership on the defining challenge of our era to China, which has become the world's largest investor in renewable energy and positions itself as the responsible steward of the planet's future. The administration withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal, undermining America's credibility as a negotiating partner and pushing Iran closer to China and Russia. It imposed tariffs on allies like Canada, Mexico, and the European Union, treating friends as adversaries and destroying trust built over generations. The cumulative effect of these actions is that America's allies no longer trust Washington's commitments and adversaries no longer fear its threats. Meanwhile, China presents itself as a stable, reliable partner committed to multilateral cooperation and win-win development. Beijing does not lecture countries about their domestic policies or demand political reforms as a condition for economic engagement. It offers investment, infrastructure, and trade with no strings attached, or at least no visible strings. For developing countries seeking capital and development assistance, China's offer is far more appealing than America's combination of economic demands and political interference. The cultural and ideological dimension is equally concerning. For much of the 20th century, America represented modernity, prosperity, and freedom to billions of people worldwide. The American dream, the idea that anyone regardless of origin could achieve success through hard work and talent, inspired generations across the globe. That narrative is collapsing under the weight of visible American decline. The world watches as American infrastructure crumbles, bridges collapsing, water systems contaminated, power grids failing. They observe soaring inequality, with a tiny elite accumulating obscene wealth, while millions struggle with poverty, homelessness, and lack of health care. They see political dysfunction, a government paralyzed by partisanship, unable to address basic challenges, lurching from crisis to crisis. They witness social decay, epidemic levels of drug addiction, gun violence, incarceration, and declining life expectancy. The American model no longer looks like success, it looks like failure. Simultaneously, China presents an alternative narrative. Despite lacking political freedoms Americans take for granted, China has lifted 800 million people out of poverty in 4 decades, the fastest and largest poverty reduction in human history. Chinese cities boast gleaming infrastructure, high-speed rail networks connecting the entire country, smart highways, modern airports, efficient public transportation. The Chinese government, whatever its flaws, demonstrates competence in executing long-term plans. It builds infrastructure, develops technology, and improves living standards at a pace that democratic systems, paralyzed by short-term electoral cycles and interest group politics, cannot match. For developing countries asking which model offers a better path to prosperity, the evidence increasingly favors China's approach over America's. This shift in perception has profound consequences. Soft power, the ability to shape preferences and influence behavior through attraction rather than coercion, has been a cornerstone of American global dominance. Hollywood movies, American music, Silicon Valley technology platforms, and American universities spread American values and generated goodwill worldwide. That soft power is eroding rapidly. Chinese technology platforms like TikTok now compete with American apps for global attention. Chinese movies increasingly dominate box offices across Asia and beyond. Chinese universities are rising in global rankings and attracting more international students. Most critically, the Chinese political model, authoritarian capitalism, is gaining adherence among governments that prioritize stability and development over democratic freedoms. From Southeast Asia to Africa to Latin America, leaders observe China's success and ask whether democracy is truly necessary for prosperity. The answer, increasingly, appears to be no. The military dimension adds urgency to this analysis. China's economic rise has funded a comprehensive modernization of its military capabilities. The People's Liberation Army, once technologically inferior and focused on territorial defense, has transformed into a sophisticated force capable of projecting power throughout Asia and increasingly beyond. China has built the world's largest navy by number of ships. It has developed advanced missile systems designed specifically to target American aircraft carriers, rendering those vessels, the foundation of U.S. naval power, vulnerable in any conflict near China's coast. It has launched satellites, built space stations, and developed anti-satellite weapons, threatening American dominance in space. It has invested heavily in cyber warfare capabilities, recognizing that future conflicts will be fought as much in digital domains as physical ones. Most alarmingly, China has developed hypersonic missiles, weapons that travel at over 5 times the speed of sound and can maneuver unpredictably, making them nearly impossible to intercept with current American missile defense systems. The U.S. military, which has enjoyed technological superiority for decades, suddenly faces an adversary that is closing the gap in critical areas and in some domains has already achieved parity or superiority. The Pentagon's own assessments acknowledge this reality. The Department of Defense warned in its most recent report on Chinese military capabilities that China could invade Taiwan successfully before American forces could intervene effectively. This is not speculation from anti-American critics. This is the sober judgment of America's own military leadership. The balance of power in the Pacific, the most economically vital region on Earth, has shifted decisively toward China, and America's ability to reverse that shift diminishes with each passing year. Taiwan represents the potential flashpoint that could trigger catastrophic conflict. The island, which China considers a renegade province, is home to the world's most advanced semiconductor manufacturing, producing over 90% of the most sophisticated chips. If China were to seize Taiwan, it would control the technology that powers everything from smartphones to fighter jets to artificial intelligence systems. America would be cut off from the semiconductors that underpin its economy and military. This is not a distant hypothetical. Chinese leaders have made clear that reunification with Taiwan is a core national interest and have refused to rule out the use of force to achieve it. Xi Jinping has stated publicly that reunification cannot be passed down from generation to generation indefinitely. Military tensions in the Taiwan Strait have escalated dramatically. Chinese military aircraft routinely violate Taiwan's airspace. The People's Liberation Army conducts large-scale exercises simulating invasion scenarios. American military officials increasingly speak of war with China, not as a possibility, but as a probability within the next decade. The Trump administration's response to this challenge has been characteristically chaotic, alternating between aggressive rhetoric and conciliatory gestures with no coherent strategy. Trump himself has made contradictory statements, at times pledging to defend Taiwan, at other times suggesting America would not intervene in a conflict. This ambiguity, rather than providing strategic flexibility, has created dangerous uncertainty. China does not know whether America would truly fight for Taiwan, so it may miscalculate and launch an invasion, triggering a war neither side truly wants. Taiwan does not know whether it can rely on American protection, so it faces impossible choices about how much to invest in its own defense versus accommodating Beijing's demands. American allies in the region, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, do not know whether they can trust American security guarantees, so they hedge their bets, moving closer to China even as they maintain alliances with Washington. This strategic incoherence, born from Trump's transactional approach to foreign policy, increases the risk of catastrophic miscalculation. What makes this crisis even more infuriating is the fact that it is largely self-inflicted. America possessed every advantage necessary to maintain its position as the world's preeminent power. It emerged from World War II controlling half the world's economy, possessing unchallenged military superiority, and leading a network of alliances spanning the globe. That inheritance has been squandered through decades of strategic short-sightedness, and Trump's policies represent the culmination of that failure. Rather than investing in education, America allowed its public schools to deteriorate while college became prohibitively expensive, saddling generations with crippling debt. Rather than rebuilding infrastructure, America allowed roads, bridges, water systems, and electrical grids to crumble while spending trillions on endless wars in the Middle East that achieved nothing. Rather than developing a coherent industrial policy to compete with China's strategic investments, America allowed free market ideology to justify the wholesale offshoring of manufacturing capacity. Rather than reforming a healthcare system that costs twice as much as peer nations while delivering worse outcomes, America preserved a system that bankrupts families and constrains economic dynamism. Rather than addressing climate change through massive investment in renewable energy and infrastructure, America denied the problem's existence while China built the industries that will dominate the 21st century economy. The Trump administration, rather than correcting these failures, has accelerated them. Tax cuts overwhelmingly benefiting the wealthy exploded the deficit without generating promised investment or growth. Deregulation of financial and environmental safeguards prioritized short-term profits over long-term stability. Infrastructure promises went unfulfilled. Healthcare reform failed. Education policy was gutted. The federal government's response to crises, from pandemics to natural disasters, has been characterized by incompetence and dysfunction. Meanwhile, China executes five-year plans, invests in strategic industries, builds infrastructure, and methodically expands its influence. The contrast could not be starker, and the world is drawing conclusions about which system works and which is failing. So here is the question I would like you to consider. Is this the America you want to leave to your children? A declining power clinging desperately to past glories while refusing to make the investments and reforms necessary for future success? The question is not whether America can reverse its decline relative to China. The question is whether Americans will demand the fundamental changes required to remain competitive in a world that no longer revolves around Washington. Every year of denial makes the eventual reckoning more severe and more painful. China's rise is not contingent on American failure. China would be growing regardless of what America does. But America's response to that rise, characterized by denial, misdirection, and counterproductive policies, is transforming manageable competition into existential crisis. The path forward requires acknowledging uncomfortable truths that neither political party wants to confront. America cannot compete with China through tariffs and trade wars. It can only compete through massive domestic investment in education, infrastructure, research, and strategic industries. This requires spending trillions of dollars over decades, money that must come from either higher taxes or reduced spending elsewhere, likely both. It requires accepting that the era of American unilateral dominance is over, and that future success depends on building coalitions and sharing leadership with allies. It requires recognizing that China's political system, however objectionable on human rights grounds, has proven effective at mobilizing resources for national priorities, and that America must find ways to achieve similar focus within a democratic framework. Most fundamentally, it requires electing leaders who tell the truth about America's position and offer realistic plans for meeting the challenge, rather than peddling comforting fantasies about easy solutions. The Trump administration offers none of this. It offers nostalgia for a past that cannot be recovered, scapegoating of foreigners for problems created by domestic policy failures, and simplistic solutions that exacerbate the very challenges they claim to address. This approach may win elections by telling Americans what they want to hear, but it will not win the competition with China. And in that competition, second place means irrelevance. The stakes could not be higher. The international order that has provided unprecedented peace and prosperity for decades is being dismantled and replaced with a new system centered on Beijing rather than Washington. The values that America claims to champion, democracy, human rights, individual freedom, are losing ground to authoritarian alternatives. The technological and economic foundations of American power are eroding. The financial architecture that has underwritten American influence is being systematically replaced, and time is running out to reverse these trends. The world is watching, and at this moment, they are watching America fail. But the consequences of this failure extend beyond national pride or great power competition. What is at stake is nothing less than the future of human civilization. If China's model of authoritarian capitalism becomes the global standard, if surveillance states and social credit systems spread worldwide, if political freedoms are subordinated to economic growth and social stability, the result will be a darker, more oppressive world. America, for all its flaws, has championed ideals of individual liberty, democratic governance, and human dignity. Those ideals are now in retreat, not because they are wrong, but because America has failed to embody them convincingly, and China offers an alternative that appears to work better for many countries. The tragedy is not that China is rising. Rising powers have always emerged throughout history. The tragedy is that America is collapsing from within, destroying through incompetence and short-sightedness what could not be defeated by any external enemy. The truly frightening realization is that this decline may be irreversible, that the choices made over the past decades have set America on a trajectory that no amount of political will can alter, and that future generations of Americans will live in a world shaped by Chinese power and Chinese values, because their predecessors refused to make the sacrifices necessary to preserve an alternative. Is this the legacy Americans want to leave? A once great nation that squandered every advantage, ignored every warning, and chose comfortable lies over hard truths until collapse became inevitable. The window for change is closing. The time for denial is over. What happens next will determine whether America adapts to new realities and finds a way to remain relevant and influential in a multipolar world, or whether it continues its current path toward economic decline, geopolitical marginalization, and eventual irrelevance. The choice ultimately belongs to the American people. But they must choose quickly, because China is not waiting, and history will not pause for America to figure out what it wants to be. The reckoning is coming, whether Americans are prepared for it or not.